Sign the contract. Marry me. And walk away with $10 million.
And if I refuse?
Then you return to being invisible.
Clara Omega lifted her calm hazel eyes to the coldest man in Manhattan. Invisible people often see what powerful men miss, Mr. Vale. The silence that followed lasted only 10 seconds, but it was the first time Alexander Vale wondered whether he had underestimated his quiet assistant. 34 floors above Manhattan, rain struck the glass walls of Vale Global's executive conference room. The city below shimmered beneath dark storm clouds, its famous towers appearing small from the headquarters of one of America's most powerful corporations. Alexander stood near the window in a perfectly tailored black suit. At 36, he was tall, broad-shouldered, and strikingly handsome, with steel-gray eyes and neatly styled dark hair. His expression rarely changed. Employees whispered that Alexander Vale could freeze an entire room simply by entering it. They never made that joke when he was present. Business magazines called him the Ice King of Wall Street. He had closed factories without blinking, dismissed senior executives during breakfast, and destroyed competitors before lunch. Under his leadership, Vale Global had expanded into technology, real estate, shipping, and renewable energy.
Then you return to
Alexander
being invisible.
trusted contracts because contracts had no feelings. They did not betray, demand affection, or pretend to love him because of his wealth. Now, however, his late grandfather's will had placed him in an impossible position. To receive the controlling shares of Vale Global, Alexander had to marry before his 37th birthday and remain married for at least 1 year. If he failed, the shares would transfer to the Vale Family Trust, whose trustees included his resentful uncle, Richard Vale. Alexander had 90 days. He did not want a wife. He needed a legal solution. That solution stood across the conference table, wearing a modest cream dress and holding a thick contract. Clara Omega had been his executive assistant for 18 months. She was 29, elegant without trying to attract attention, with long chestnut brown hair, intelligent hazel eyes, and a graceful confidence she carefully concealed beneath quiet professionalism. Clara attended
Sign the
charity
contract.
galas,
Marry
knew
me.
several old New York
Marry me
families,
for-
and appeared in society photographs only occasionally. Alexander knew the Omega name carried history, but he assumed the family's fortune had disappeared years ago. She never interrupted meetings or competed for attention. She took notes, remembered important details, and noticed problems before they became disasters. Because she rarely spoke unless necessary, Alexander mistook her restraint for weakness. The contract reflected that assumption. They would share his penthouse, but maintain separate bedrooms. They would make public appearances when required. There would be no emotional expectations, no interference in one another's private affairs, and no claim against future assets. At the end of 1 year, Clara would receive $10 million. "Do you understand the terms?" Alexander asked. "Perfectly. You will resign as my assistant after the wedding." "Of course. And you will not interfere in Vale Global." Clara's eyes paused on his face. "That condition is important to you?" "My company is not your concern." A nearly invisible smile touched
This
her
is the
lips.
standard agreement.
"Then you
But
should
what
have
if they
written the
don't
clause
agree?
more carefully." Alexander frowned. His attorney, Daniel Cross, shifted uncomfortably. Clara had already identified 3 serious ambiguities in a contract prepared by one of Manhattan's most expensive legal teams. Alexander pushed the pen toward her. "Are you signing or not?" Clara looked at the signature line. She had her own reasons for accepting, but Alexander knew nothing about them. "Add one condition," she said. "During our marriage, neither of us will deliberately lie when the other asks a direct question." Alexander gave a dismissive shrug. "Fine." The amendment was inserted. Clara signed. Alexander signed immediately after her, then closed the folder as though he had completed another corporate acquisition. "There," he said. "It's done." Clara placed the pen on the table. "No, Mr. Vale, it has just begun." 3 weeks later, they were married in a private ceremony at the Vale family estate in Connecticut. Marble columns surrounded the garden, white roses climbed the golden arches, and a string quartet played beneath ancient oak trees. The ceremony appeared romantic to the photographers invited to document it. In reality, Alexander treated the wedding like a corporate press conference. He kissed Clara's cheek instead of her lips. That evening, he led her through his luxurious Manhattan penthouse and stopped outside the guest suite. "This will be your room," he said. "The staff have been instructed to provide whatever you require." Clara glanced inside. Everything was expensive, flawless, and cold. "My schedule is demanding," Alexander continued. "I leave at 6 every morning. Dinner is normally served at 9, but you do not need to wait for me." "I wasn't planning to." His eyes narrowed slightly. He was accustomed to people being disappointed when he withheld his attention. Clara simply entered the room and closed the door. During the first month, Alexander attempted to control every detail of their arrangement. His housekeeper selected Clara's clothing for public appearances. His security team tracked her movements. His public relations department prepared answers for her interviews. Clara quietly changed everything that did not suit her. When the stylist delivered a silver gown chosen by Alexander, Clara wore an emerald one. When his communications director gave her rehearsed responses, she answered reporters in her own words. At a children's hospital fundraiser, Clara ignored the wealthy donors competing for photographs and spent most of the evening comforting a frightened 8-year-old girl awaiting heart surgery. Alexander watched from across the ballroom as Clara knelt beside the child. "Being afraid doesn't mean you are weak," Clara told her gently. "Courage is taking the next step while your hands are still shaking." The child smiled and reached for her hand. The image appeared on the front page the following morning. Donations to the hospital tripled. "You created a strong publicity moment," Alexander said over breakfast. Clara lowered her coffee. "It wasn't a publicity moment. Her name is Lily." The result was beneficial either way. "Not everything kind has to be calculated, Alexander." He returned his attention to the financial newspaper, but her words remained with him. At Vail Global, trouble was spreading. A failed technology acquisition had cost the company $800 million. Several directors blamed Alexander's aggressive expansion strategy. Vail Global's stock price began falling, and confidential information was leaked to the press. Richard Vail used the crisis to challenge his nephew's leadership. "Alexander has confused ruthlessness with wisdom," Richard declared during a televised interview. "Vail Global requires stable leadership." Behind closed doors, Richard gathered votes to remove Alexander as CEO. Alexander worked 18-hour days. He stopped sleeping properly and survived on coffee. Clara noticed the untouched meals, the headaches he concealed, and the way he rubbed the scar near his right wrist whenever he felt cornered. One night, she found him alone in the penthouse study, surrounded by financial reports. "You missed dinner again," she said. "I didn't realize my eating habits were included in your contract." "They aren't. But unconscious men make poor CEOs. I'm not going to collapse. You have consumed 6 cups of coffee and half a sandwich in 16 hours. Alexander looked up sharply. "How would you know that?" "I observe." "You spy." "There's a difference. Spies look for secrets. Observant people notice what others reveal." She placed a bowl of hot soup beside him. Alexander studied her as if she were a puzzle. "Why are you doing this?" "Because kindness should not depend on whether affection is returned." For once, Alexander had no response. Clara glanced at the reports covering his desk. "The takeover isn't Richard's idea." Alexander stiffened. "What did you say?" "Your uncle is ambitious but impatient. This campaign is too disciplined for him. Someone is advising him. You know nothing about this company. I know Richard purchased shares through 3 investment groups 2 weeks before the acquisition report became public. I also know someone manipulated the projections presented to your risk committee." Alexander slowly stood. "How did you get that information?" "You asked a direct question, but that was 2 questions." "Clara." She met his stare without fear. "I read the public filings. Your executives assumed no one would compare them with the offshore registrations." Alexander opened one of the reports. She had marked several transactions with a pencil. "The connections were subtle, but they were real. You discovered this from public records?" "Most secrets aren't completely hidden," Clara said. "They're scattered." It was the second time Alexander realized he had underestimated his wife. The following morning, his investigators confirmed her theory. Richard was working with Victor Dane, the ruthless founder of Dane Industries and the Vail family's oldest corporate enemy. Alexander confronted Richard, but his uncle only smiled. "The board meets Friday," Richard said. "By lunchtime, you'll no longer be CEO." Alexander believed he could still win. He contacted every director who had once pledged loyalty to him, but promises disappeared as the company's stock price continued falling. By Thursday night, his chief financial officer delivered the devastating calculation. Richard had secured 48% of the voting power. 2 undecided directors controlled another 7%. Alexander's removal was almost certain. There was another complication. For 6 months, an unknown offshore company called Aurelia Holdings had quietly purchased Vail Global shares. Aurelia now controlled 22% of the voting stock, making it the company's largest independent shareholder. No one knew who owned it. Alexander's team had sent emails, legal notices, and meeting requests. None had received an answer. On Friday morning, Alexander dressed in a charcoal suit and stood before the bedroom mirror. His face revealed nothing, but Clara saw the tension in his shoulders. "You expect to lose," she said. "I don't lose." That wasn't an answer. He turned toward her. "You enjoy reminding me about that clause." "I enjoy honest conversations." Alexander adjusted his cufflinks. "Yes, unless Aurelia Holdings supports me, the board will remove me." "Would that frighten you?" "I built this company. Your grandfather built it. You expanded it." His jaw tightened. "Is this really the morning you want to challenge my pride?" "It may be the last morning anyone can." Alexander stared at her. Clara approached and straightened his tie. Her fingers were gentle, and for a moment, the cold billionaire forgot about the board meeting. "Power reveals character," she said quietly. "But losing power reveals it more clearly. Whatever happens today, decide what kind of man will leave that room." Alexander's voice softened. "Will you be here when I return?" "If you ask me to be." He hesitated. Asking was not something Alexander Vail did easily. "Be here," he said. Clara raised an eyebrow. "That still sounds like an order." "Please, I'll consider it." At 10 o'clock, the emergency board meeting began. The Vail Global boardroom occupied the top floor of the Manhattan Tower. A 30-foot walnut table stretched beneath sculpted glass lights. Portraits of former Vail chairmen watched from the walls. Alexander sat at the head of the table. Richard sat opposite him, smiling confidently. He was 58, silver-haired and polished, with the smooth charm of a politician and the patience of a predator. 14 directors filled the remaining seats. Lawyers and financial advisors stood along the walls. Richard presented his motion. "Due to reckless acquisitions, declining shareholder confidence, and repeated failures of executive judgment, I move to remove Alexander Vail as Chief Executive Officer." The company secretary recorded the motion. Alexander spoke without notes. He defended the expansion strategy, explained the manipulated projections, and presented evidence connecting Richard to Victor Dane. Some directors looked disturbed, but Richard remained calm. "Desperate accusations from a desperate man," he said. Voting began. Each declaration struck like a hammer. Support the motion. Oppose. Support. Support. When the initial votes were counted, Richard controlled enough shares to remove Alexander, unless Aurelia Holdings intervened. The company secretary looked toward the empty chair reserved for Aurelia's representative. "No representative has registered," she said. "We will proceed without munching in." The boardroom doors opened. Every head turned. Clara entered wearing a fitted white suit with gold buttons. Her chestnut hair fell in polished waves over her shoulders, and her expression held none of the silence Alexander had mistaken for submission. 2 attorneys followed her. Behind them came Evelyn Grant, one of the most respected corporate lawyers in America. Alexander rose slowly. "Clara?" She did not look at him immediately. She walked to the empty chair, placed a leather folder on the table, and addressed the company secretary. "Clara Omega Vail, authorized representative and beneficial owner of Aurelia Holdings." Shock swept through the room. Richard's smile disappeared. Alexander stared at his wife. You own Aurelia? Clara finally met his eyes. Yes. Evelyn distributed legal documents proving that Clara controlled 22% of Vale Global. Together with additional shares held through her late mother's estate, her total voting interest reached 31%. Richard pushed back his chair. This is impossible. No, Clara replied. It was merely invisible to you. She explained that her mother, Eleanor Dane Omega, had been Victor Dane's estranged sister. Decades earlier, Eleanor had inherited a large collection of Vale shares following a settlement between the rival families. Clara received the stake after her mother's death, but kept her ownership private. Victor had tried for years to pressure Clara into selling. When she refused, he began plotting with Richard to seize Vale Global and destroy Alexander. Alexander's voice was low. You knew about the takeover. I suspected it. And you married me without telling me who you were? You never asked. The truth landed harder than any insult. Alexander had researched her education, social history, and finances, yet he had never asked Clara about her family. He had seen only what supported his assumptions, a quiet woman, a modest lifestyle, and an employee he believed he could control with money. Richard recovered from his shock. Whatever family story she tells, the motion remains valid. Clara turned toward him. You are correct. Let us vote. Richard looked confident again. You cannot seriously support a man who treated you like property. Alexander's face tightened, but Clara remained composed. I do not support arrogance, she said. Nor do I excuse disrespect. Alexander believed wealth made him the most powerful person in every room. He was wrong. Several directors lowered their eyes. But this takeover is not designed to protect Vale Global. It is designed to dismantle it. Richard promised Victor Dane control of the renewable energy division, the shipping network, and 12,000 employee contracts. She opened her folder and displayed signed communications between Richard and Victor. Richard went pale. Clara continued, if this takeover succeeds, thousands of people will lose their jobs while two bitter men divide the company's assets. She looked around the table. A corporation is not only a collection of buildings, stocks, and contracts. It is also the security guard working the night shift, the mother in accounting paying her daughter's tuition, and the engineer who has spent 15 years developing cleaner energy. Leadership that forgets people eventually destroys everything it claims to protect. Then she cast Aurelia Holdings' votes against Richard's motion. The balance shifted instantly. Two undecided directors followed her. The motion failed. Alexander remained CEO, but Clara had not finished. I moved to remove Richard Vale from the board pending a full investigation into fraud, market manipulation, and breach of fiduciary duty. The motion passed overwhelmingly. Security entered to escort Richard from the room. As he reached the doors, Richard glared at Clara. You think he'll respect you now? Men like Alexander don't change. Clara looked toward her husband. Then he will lose more than his company. When the doors closed, every director stood. Alexander assumed they were leaving. Instead, one after another, they turned toward Clara in a formal gesture of respect. Some applauded, others simply bowed their heads. The board had not stood because she was Alexander Vale's wife. They stood because the quiet woman he had treated like an asset had just saved the entire company. Alexander remained motionless at the head of the table. For the first time in his career, someone else held the room. He did not resent her for it. He admired her. If you believe quiet people can carry extraordinary strength, subscribe now, because Clara's next decision will change both their lives. After the meeting, Alexander found her alone beside the boardroom window. Why did you save me? He asked. I saved the company. Then why keep me as CEO? Clara folded her arms. Because despite your faults, you are capable. You see opportunities others miss, and your employees trust your competence, even when they fear your personality. That is not an answer. It is the answer you earned. Alexander stepped closer. What happens now? Now the terms change. You want more money? Clara laughed softly. It was the first time he had heard the sound without restraint. I could purchase your penthouse before lunch, Alexander. His pride should have been wounded. Instead, he almost smiled. Clara continued, Aurelia Holdings will take 3 board seats. I will become executive chairwoman. Every major acquisition will require an independent risk review. Employee protection will be included in all restructuring decisions. And our marriage? The original contract remains legally valid, but I am offering an amendment. She handed him a single sheet of paper. Alexander read it. There were no financial demands. The amendment required mutual respect, honesty, equal decision-making within the home, and 1 dinner together every week without staff members, lawyers, or phones. He looked up. This is your new corporate order? This is my minimum standard for being treated like a human being. Alexander signed without negotiating. Clara appeared surprised. You didn't read the final paragraph. I trust you. Her expression softened. Trust was a small word, but for Alexander it represented a revolution. Over the following months, Vale Global recovered. Clara proved to be a disciplined chairwoman, balancing Alexander's bold strategies with careful analysis. Where he moved too quickly, she demanded evidence. Where the board became timid, she encouraged courage. They argued often. Their arguments were sharp, intelligent, and increasingly enjoyable. At home, Alexander stopped giving orders and began asking questions. He learned that Clara loved old jazz records, spicy food, and repairing antique clocks. She learned that he secretly funded scholarships for children who had lost their parents, although he had never allowed his name to appear on the donations. The cold man was not heartless. He had simply spent years protecting his heart so fiercely that he had forgotten how to use it. One evening, they returned to the children's hospital and visited Lily after her successful surgery. The little girl hugged Clara and then looked suspiciously at Alexander. "Are you her husband?" "Contractually," Alexander replied. Clara gave him a warning look. Lily frowned. "Do you love her?" Alexander, who could negotiate billion-dollar agreements without hesitation, became silent. Clara rescued him. "That is a complicated question." Lily shook her head. "My mom says love is only complicated when grown-ups are scared to tell the truth." On the drive home, neither of them spoke for several minutes. Then Alexander said, "I was wrong about you. That is not breaking news. I thought being quiet meant you had nothing to say. Quietness is not emptiness. Sometimes it is discipline. I treated you badly." "You did. I'm trying to become better." "I know." Alexander looked at the woman beside him, the assistant he had overlooked, the wife he had tried to purchase, and the chairwoman who now held enough power to remove him. "What happens when the year ends?" he asked. Clara watched the Manhattan lights passing beyond the window. "The contract ends. And us? That depends. On what?" She turned toward him. "On whether you want a powerful alliance or a real marriage." Alexander reached across the seat, but stopped before touching her hand, silently asking permission. Clara placed her hand in his. "For most of my life," he said, "I believed power meant never needing anyone. And now? Now I think real power may be finding someone strong enough to stand beside you and becoming humble enough to let them." Clara smiled. It was not a promise of forever, not yet. But as their hands remained joined between them, the frozen arrangement began to melt into something neither contract could define. The ruthless billionaire had forced his quiet assistant into marriage because he thought she needed his money. He never imagined she would save his empire, become his superior, and teach him that kindness was not weakness. Sometimes the person the world overlooks is the one carrying the power to transform it. Never measure someone's worth by how loudly they speak, how simply they dress, or how little they reveal. A humble heart can hide a brilliant mind, and true strength does not always announce itself before entering the room. As the car moved through the glowing streets of Manhattan, Alexander looked at Clara and asked the one question no lawyer had prepared. "Will you stay after the contract?" Clara squeezed his hand. "Give me a reason that money cannot buy." For the first time in his life, Alexander Vale understood that winning her heart would be the most difficult and most meaningful deal he had ever pursued. If you want to see whether this contract marriage becomes a genuine love story, like this video, subscribe and tell us in the comments. Should Clara make Alexander prove his love, or should she walk away when the year ends? Because contracts may create partnerships, wealth may build empires, and power may command a room, but only honesty, respect, and kindness can turn two guarded hearts into a home.